Hey guys, tonight we're not just drifting off a lullaby. We're stepping into the dusty boots of an 18th century European explorer who's just seen something that simply cannot be real. You're standing on a sun-baked Australian shoreline, squinting at the horizon where strange creatures hop across the landscape like they've been wound up by some celestial clockmaker. One of them pauses, turning its head to look at you like you're the weird one. And honestly, if you try to survive in this world without knowing what you were doing, without understanding why no one back home believed in kangaroos, you probably wouldn't make it past the first wallaby encounter, or the stingray that killed a famous captain, or even the sandflies that seem to have taken a personal interest in your ankles. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love imagining all of us drifting off together across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You adjust your tricorn hat, brush sand off your coat, and wonder how something as absurd looking as a kangaroo could become one of history's most doubted animals. Well, grab your blanket, because we're about to find out together. You squint at the shoreline, the sun beating down on your back as a salty breeze rolls in from the ocean. The landscape ahead stretches out in golden waves of sand and scrubland, dotted with strange trees that don't seem to follow any kind of botanical logic you recognize. Somewhere beyond those dunes, something is moving, something fast, something low to the ground, something hopping? Yes, hopping. At first, you think it's a trick of the light, a mirage shimmering in the heat like a sailor's fever dream. But no, it's real. A creature, maybe the size of a dog, bounds forward in great leaps, its long legs propelling it across the terrain like it was wound up by some celestial clockmaker. It pauses for a moment, turning its head toward you, ears twitching, eyes wide with mild curiosity or mild suspicion. You can't tell which. And honestly, who could blame it? You're not exactly dressed for the outback. Your heavy coat clings to your skin, your boots sink into sand, and your tricorn hat offers about as much protection from the sun as a paper umbrella in a monsoon. Meanwhile, this animal stands there, perfectly adapted to its world. Lean, muscular, built for survival. You glance around, hoping someone else has seen this. Surely another explorer, a sailor. Someone must have noticed this absurd-looking beast bouncing to the brush like it belongs in a fable rather than reality. But no one reacts. Not even the ship's naturalist, who's too busy collecting shells to pay attention to what might be the most important discovery of the voyage. Because right now, you're witnessing something extraordinary. Something so bizarre, so utterly unlike anything back home in Europe, that it defies belief. And yet, here it is, alive, real, watching you with the same cautious interest you're giving it. Historians still argue whether early European explorers truly failed to believe in kangaroos, or if their skepticism was exaggerated by later writers trying to make a point about colonial ignorance. Either way, one thing is certain. When you're staring at an animal that looks like it was stitched together from parts of a rabbit, a deer, and a frog, disbelief feels like the only reasonable response. So you take a deep breath, let the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You flip through the pages of the ship's log, your fingers smudged with ink and salt as you read the neat, looping script of Captain James Cook himself. The journal smells faintly of damp wood and tobacco, the scent of long nights at sea, and even longer days spent trying to make sense of a world that refuses to follow familiar rules. There, in the margin of an otherwise routine entry about wind speeds and supplies, he writes something strange. This day, I observed a creature unlike any beast known in England. It moved upon its hind legs with great speed, bounding forward in leaps exceeding those of any deer. Its tail was long and strong, used not for balance alone, but as a third limb to support its weight when at rest. And most curiously of all, it bore a pouch upon its belly, within which it carried its young. You blink, read it again, then glance out toward the shore, where the same creature you saw earlier is still hopping to the brush like it belongs in a dream rather than reality. Because yes, this is how it started. not with grand scientific declarations or museum exhibitions, but with scribbled notes from a man who had just seen something so utterly bizarre that he didn't quite know what to do with it. Cook wasn't the first European to set foot on this land, but he was the first to document it thoroughly. He and his crew spent months mapping the eastern coast of Australia, observing the landscape, the people, the animals, and yes, the kangaroos. They were fascinated by them, though fascinated might be too generous a word. Most of them were confused. Some were suspicious. A few were convinced they were hallucinating. Historians still argue whether Cook truly believed in the existence of kangaroos, or if he simply recorded them because he knew people back home would want a good story. Some believe the early descriptions were exaggerated, shaped more by sailor superstition than scientific accuracy. Others think the sheer consistency of the reports, from multiple crew members across different voyages, proves that these creatures were real enough to warrant serious attention. Either way, one thing is certain. When you're writing about an animal that looks like it was stitched together from parts of a rabbit, a deer, and a frog, disbelief feels like the only reasonable response. So you close the journal, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like the midday sun, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You hold up the drawing, tilting it slightly under the flickering glow of an oil lamp. The paper is rough, stained faintly with salt from the sea air, and the ink has smudged in places where fingers lingered too long over its strange lines. But still, the creature stares back at you. Something that should not exist, yet clearly does. It's odd, no doubt about it. The artist at their best. But even the most skilled hand struggles to capture what the mind refuses to believe. The body looks like a stretched-out dog, all lean muscle and awkward angles. The ears are too long, almost rabbit-like. The legs, good lord, the legs, are disproportionately large, ending in feet so exaggerated they look like something out of a cartoon. And then there's the tail, thick, muscular, planted firmly on the ground, as if it were a third leg rather than just a balancing tool. And the pouch? Oh, yes, the pouch. Drawn in careful strokes, nestled beneath the belly like some kind of built-in satchel. It adds another layer of absurdity to an already improbable creature. Who designs an animal like this? Nature, apparently, with zero concern for what makes sense to human logic. You can almost hear the murmurs of disbelief back in London. A noblewoman fans herself while muttering, "Surely this is a hoax." A scientist squints suspiciously, muttering something about hoaxes and sailor tall tales. A child, wide-eyed and full of wonder, asks, "Can I keep one?" Because no matter how carefully the sketch was drawn, no matter how many times Cook's men described the hopping beast bounding through the brush, one thing remained certain. This thing looked made up. Historians still argue whether the early sketches of kangaroos were accurate representations or exaggerated interpretations shaped by European expectations. Some believe the artist deliberately distorted the proportions to make the creatures seem more exotic, more otherworldly. Others think the drawings were honest attempts to capture something utterly unfamiliar, like trying to describe a cloud with only charcoal and parchment. Either way, one thing is clear. This wasn't just an animal. It was a challenge to belief itself. You step into a grand drawing room, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and overpriced perfume. The walls are lined with oil paintings of hunting scenes, naval victories, and portraits of men who look like they would deeply disapprove of anything that hops instead of walks properly. A fire crackles in the hearth, casting warm light over velvet chairs where nobles lounge, sipping brandy and discussing the latest scientific theories, or at least what passes for them when you've only read half a book on natural history and prefer to argue about it anyway. And right now, they're arguing about kangaroos. A gentleman in an embroidered waistcoat waves a letter in the air like he's trying to summon a spirit. "It's preposterous," he declares. A creature with legs like a grasshopper, a tail like a crocodile, and a pouch like some sort of unnatural marsupial? Nonsense. This is clearly a sailor's exaggeration. Across the room, a woman in a towering wig fans herself dramatically. I heard from a cousin of mine, his brother once sailed with Captain Cook, that these creatures were nothing more than large rats dressed up in costumes by the locals. Why, if I saw one hopping through Hyde Park, I'd scream so loudly it would send the entire city running. A scholar adjusts his spectacles, peering down his nose at the assembled guests. Gentlemen, ladies, let us not forget that even Aristotle described creatures with pouches, though I suspect he was referring to womb-like structures rather than some designed for carrying offspring around like a traveling trunk. You glance at the sketch being passed around the room. A rough drawing brought back from Australia, its lines smudged from too many curious fingers. Some nod thoughtfully, others scoff, and one man keeps muttering about how this must be some elaborate hoax cooked up by sailors looking for extra rations. Historians still argue whether European skepticism toward kangaroos was rooted in genuine disbelief or simply a reluctance to accept that the world contained things beyond their understanding. Some believe the reports were exaggerated by explorers eager to impress patrons back home. Others think the sheer strangeness of the animal made it difficult to accept without seeing it firsthand. Either way, one thing is certain. In a world where science and superstition often blur together, kangaroos had a lot to prove. So you sip your drink, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like the midday sun, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You sit among the gathered scholars, their voices rising and falling like the tide outside. The Royal Society meeting hall is grand but dimly lit. Its tall windows letting in only faint traces of daylight filtered through London's ever-present smog. Books line the walls, weighty tomes filled with centuries of knowledge theories and the occasional wild guess that later turn out to be complete nonsense. And now, at the center of today's debate, a creature so absurd it defies categorization. A man in a powdered wig clears his throat, adjusting his spectacles as he peers down at the kangaroo sketch spread across the table. Gentlemen, he begins, voice clipped and formal, we must ask ourselves, are we to believe that nature has produced an animal so utterly unlike anything previously documented? A beast that hops rather than walks, carries its young in a pouch, and stands upright as if it were some sort of quadrupedal human. Another scholar scoffs, tapping his quill against a notebook. I have seen drawings of the so-called kangaroo, and I remain unconvinced. It bears the markings of exaggeration, perhaps even outright deception. Sailors have long been known for their embellishments, after all. Across the room, a third man leans forward, eyes alight with curiosity. And yet, Captain Cook himself described the creature in his journals. Multiple crew members witnessed it. Even the indigenous people of New Holland refer to it by name. Surely, there must be some truth to these accounts. The debate rages on. Some argue that the creature must be a hoax, an elaborate fabrication meant to impress patrons or secure funding for further expeditions. Others suggest it might be a misidentified species, perhaps a type of hare or deer distorted by distance and poor lighting. A few brave souls propose that it could be something entirely new, an animal unlike any found in Europe or Asia. But most agree on one thing. Until someone brings back a proper specimen, they cannot accept its existence as fact. Historians still argue whether the skepticism toward kangaroos was rooted in genuine disbelief or simply a reluctance to admit that the world contained things beyond European understanding. Some believe the early descriptions were exaggerated, shaped more by sailor superstition than scientific accuracy. Others think the sheer strangeness of the animal made it difficult to accept without seeing it firsthand. Either way, one thing is certain. In a world where science and superstition often blur together, kangaroos had a lot to prove. So you lean back in your chair, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like the midday sun, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You stand in the dimly lit back room of a London Natural History Museum, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of varnish. The space is lined with shelves filled with jars of preserved specimens. Snakes curled in liquid amber, birds frozen mid-squawk, insects pinned like forgotten memories. And there, beneath a white sheet draped over a wooden frame, is something new, something strange. The curator, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the air of someone who has seen too many things that defy explanation, gestures toward the covered form. This, he says with great ceremony, is proof. With a dramatic flourish, he pulls the cloth aside, and there it is, a kangaroo, or rather what remains of one. stuffed, stretched, and mounted on a wooden base to give the illusion of life. Its limbs are locked in an awkward pose, caught mid-hop as if startled by its own existence. Its eyes, glass replicas, stare blankly ahead, unblinking. Its tail stands rigid behind it, a testament to the animal's peculiar anatomy. And yes, the pouch is still there, stitched carefully into place like it was too important to forget. Gasps ripple through the gathered crowd of scholars, nobles, and curious onlookers. Some lean in closer, peering at the creature with expressions ranging from fascination to outright horror. Others take a cautious step back, as if expecting it to suddenly spring to life and bound across the room. This is real? One woman whispers, her fan frozen mid-flutter. Indeed, the curator replies, voice tinged with pride. Brought all the way from New Holland, carefully preserved for your viewing pleasure. And just like that, disbelief begins to crack. Because no drawing, no journal entry, no sailor's tale could quite compare to standing face-to-face with a creature that should not exist but clearly does. Historians still argue whether these early stuffed specimens were accurate representations or exaggerated interpretations shaped by European expectations. Some believe the taxidermists of the time struggled to capture the true form of the animal, resulting in stiff, unnatural poses that only deepen the mystery. Others think the very act of displaying a kangaroo in a museum helped cement its place in scientific reality, forcing even the most skeptical minds to admit that nature had created something utterly unique. Either way, one thing is certain. When you're staring at a dead kangaroo in a London museum, disbelief feels like the only reasonable response. So you take a deep breath, let the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You stand beside Carl Linnaeus, the great father of modern taxonomy, as he dips his quill into a pot of ink and carefully scrawls across a fresh sheet of parchment. The air in his study smells of paper, candle wax, and the faint musk of preserved specimens tucked away in glass jars. Outside, the wind rustles through the trees of Uppsala, Sweden, but inside, the world is quiet, save for the soft scratching of quill against paper and the occasional murmur of thought. Linnaeus squints at the specimen before him. A drawing, a description, perhaps even a preserved pelt sent from the far reaches of the world. He has seen many strange creatures in his time, cataloged them all with meticulous precision, assigned them Latin names that will echo through history. But this one is different. He pauses, considering. What do you call an animal that hops, that stands upright like a human, yet moves with the speed of a deer, that carries its young in a pouch like no other creature known to science? And then, with a decisive stroke of his pen, he writes, Macropus, meaning long foot, a name that captures the essence of this bizarre beast, not just its anatomy, but its very way of moving through the world. Because yes, this is how the kangaroo officially entered the scientific record, not just as a curiosity, not just as a sailor's tale, but as a documented species, classified alongside lions, tigers, and every other creature under the sun. Historians still argue whether Linnaeus truly understood what he was naming, or if he simply took the reports at face value, without ever seeing a live kangaroo himself. Some believe he based his classification on second-hand descriptions, relying on the accounts of explorers and naturalists who had only glimpsed the animal in passing. Others think he recognized the significance immediately, understanding that this was something entirely new, something unlike anything Europe had encountered before. Either way, one thing is certain. When you give something a Latin name, it becomes real. So you watch as Linnaeus sets down his quill, satisfied with his work, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You sit with an indigenous elder beneath the shade of a eucalyptus tree, the sun casting dappled light through the leaves as cicadas hum in the distance. The air is thick with the scent of dry earth and crushed herbs, and around you, life moves at its own unhurried pace. Birds flit between branches, lizards dart across warm rocks, and somewhere nearby, a kangaroo grazes quietly, unaware that it has become the subject of centuries of European confusion. The elder speaks in their native tongue, the words flowing like water over smooth stones. You listen carefully as the translator repeats the name they use for this creature, kangaroo. It's not just a word. It's a history, a story, a way of understanding the world. To them, the kangaroo is not some strange anomaly, not a scientific curiosity brought back to London museums. It is simply part of life, woven into the land, the stories, the survival of their people for thousands of years. And yet, when Captain Cook and his crew first heard the word, they wrote it down as best they could. Kangaroo, a mispronunciation, a misunderstanding, a name that would stick, even as its origins were lost in translation. Because yes, the Europeans didn't just struggle to believe in kangaroos. They struggled to understand them on any level beyond their own expectations. They arrived in a land filled with creatures unlike anything they had ever seen. Platypuses that defied classification, birds that mimic human speech, snakes that glided through the air, and they tried to make sense of it all through the lens of what they already knew. So when they asked the locals what this hopping beast was called, they got an answer. But whether that answer meant kangaroo or something else entirely is still debated by linguists today. Some believe the word they recorded actually meant "I don't know" in the local Gugi Yimithir language, a response given confused sailors who kept asking about an animal they clearly hadn't encountered before. Others think it was a genuine attempt to translate, a rough approximation of a word that carried meaning far deeper than mere identification. Historians still argue whether the miscommunication was deliberate or accidental, whether it stemmed from arrogance or simple linguistic barriers. Some believe the Europeans never truly sought to understand indigenous perspectives, preferring instead to impose their own frameworks onto a world that refused to fit neatly into their books. Others think the confusion was inevitable, a natural result of two cultures meeting for the first time, each speaking a language shaped by vastly different experiences. Either way, one thing is certain. Long before Europe discovered the kangaroo, Australia had known it for millennia. So you lean back against a tree, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You flip through the pages of an old newspaper, the ink faded but still legible beneath your fingertips. The paper is brittle, yellowed with age, and carries a faint scent of dust and forgotten curiosity. It's a London broadsheet from the late 18th century, filled with reports of naval victories, royal scandals, and the occasional scientific debate that seems less about discovery and more about who can sound the most condescending. And there, nestled between an article on the latest fashion trends, apparently wigs are still in, and a scathing editorial on the American colonies, you find it. A ridiculous creature said to hop across the land, more fiction than fact. You read on. The writer, clearly someone who has never left the city and probably thinks Australia is just a slightly warmer version of Scotland, scoffs at the idea of such an animal existing. We are asked to believe, they write, that there exists in this far-flung land a beast which moves not by walking or running, but by bouncing upon its hind legs like some mechanical toy wound too tightly, that it carries its young in a pouch upon its belly, as though nature had grown bored of conventional reproduction methods and decided to experiment with absurdity. They go on to suggest that these so-called kangaroos are likely misidentified deer, or perhaps large hares trained to hop unnaturally by clever locals hoping to impress gullible sailors. Others, they claim, may be outright fabrications, hoaxes designed to amuse or to justify further colonial expeditions under the guise of scientific discovery. Because yes, even after sketches had been drawn, specimens stuffed and displayed, and Carl Linnaeus himself had given the creature a proper Latin name, many Europeans still refuse to believe that kangaroos were real. Historians still argue whether the skepticism was rooted in genuine disbelief or simply a reluctance to admit that the world contained things beyond European understanding. Some believe the early descriptions were exaggerated, shaped more by sailor superstition than scientific accuracy. Others think the sheer strangeness of the animal made it difficult to accept without seeing it firsthand. Either way, one thing is certain. When you're reading a newspaper article mocking the very existence of an animal that clearly does exist, disbelief feels like the only reasonable response. So you turn the page, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like the midday sun, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You wander through a grand art gallery, the polished wooden floors creaking softly beneath your feet. The air is thick with the scent of varnish and candle wax, and the soft murmur of visitors fills the space like a hushed reverence for history itself. Portraits line the walls, stern-faced nobles, heroic generals, and ladies in elaborate gowns that seem to defy both gravity and practicality. But tucked between these portraits of human grandeur are something far stranger. Kangaroos. Or at least, what artists of the time thought kangaroos looked like. One painting shows a creature resembling a dog with rabbit ears and an exaggeratedly long tail, standing upright like it's about to propose marriage. Another depicts something more akin to a fox with oversized hind legs and a pouch that looks suspiciously like a misplaced stomach. One particularly ambitious artist has even given their kangaroo antlers, as though unsure whether classified as a mammal or a mythical beast from an old fable. And yet, despite their inaccuracies, these paintings tell a story of fascination, confusion, and a slow, stumbling journey toward understanding something utterly foreign. Because, yes, when European artists first tried to depict kangaroos, they had very little to go on. Most had never seen a live specimen. Only rough sketches brought back by sailors, or stuffed animals mounted in museums with poses so stiff and unnatural that they barely resemble what the creatures actually look like in motion. Some artists worked from second-hand descriptions, others from imagination, and a few, frankly, just made things up because why not? The result? A collection of kangaroos that look more like fantasy creatures than real animals. Some stand rigidly on all fours, their bodies elongated beyond reason. Others appear poised mid-hop, frozen in a moment of movement that seems less graceful and more like they've been startled mid-thought. And then there are the pouches, drawn with varying degrees of accuracy, sometimes placed too high, sometimes too low, and occasionally left out entirely, as if the artist had simply forgotten about them halfway through. Historians still argue whether these early depictions were meant to be accurate representations or artistic interpretations shaped by European expectations. Some believe the painters deliberately distorted the proportions to make the creatures seem more exotic, more otherworldly. Others think the drawings were honest attempts to capture something utterly unfamiliar, like trying to describe a cloud with only charcoal and parchment. Either way, one thing is certain: these paintings weren't just art. They were proof. Visual evidence that Australia held creatures unlike anything found in Europe, even if those creatures looked like they belonged in a dream rather than reality. So you move from canvas to canvas, feeling the weight of history pressing down on you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You lean back in your chair, the softness of a fan blending with the quiet murmur of history, settling around you like dust on an old bookshelf. Outside, the world is asleep, or at least it should be by now. The stars stretch endlessly across the sky, and somewhere far away, a night bird calls out into the dark, its song echoing through time like a whisper from the past. And as you sit here, wrapped in the warmth of blankets and the weight of centuries, you realize something strange. The kangaroo, once doubted, once dismissed as myth or exaggeration, has become more than just an animal. It has become a symbol, a cultural touchstone, a creature that, despite its absurdity, somehow carved its place not just in nature, but in human imagination. Because yes, the kangaroo's journey from disbelief to acceptance wasn't just about science. It was about storytelling, about the way humans process the unfamiliar, how we shape what we don't understand into something we can grasp, even if that means drawing it with rabbit ears, giving it antlers, or calling a hoax until someone finally stuffs one and puts it on display. But once the truth took hold, once people saw the hopping beast with their own eyes, once naturalists documented its biology, once artists tried, and sometimes failed, to capture its likeness, it became something more. It became Australia itself. Because when you think of Australia, what do you see? Not just beaches and eucalyptus trees, not just boomerangs and didgeridoos, but kangaroos bounding across the outback, silhouetted against sunsets, standing tall in the golden grass like they've always belonged there. They're on the country's coat of arms, on tourist brochures, on the tail fins of airplanes. They've been mascots for sporting teams, characters in cartoons, and even unofficial national symbols long before any government officially decided such things. And yet, for all their modern ubiquity, Their story began with doubt, with skepticism so deep it bordered on outright dismissal, with scientists who couldn't believe their eyes, nobles who laughed at the idea, sailors who struggled to describe something so utterly unlike anything they'd seen before. Historians still argue whether the kangaroo's rise to cultural prominence was inevitable or shaped by circumstance. Some believe its uniqueness made it stand out in a world already fascinated by exotic animals. Others think its image was carefully cultivated over time, turned into a symbol not just of Australia, but of everything Europe once found incomprehensible. Either way, one thing is certain. When you look at a kangaroo now, you're not just seeing an animal. You're seeing a story, a legend, a reminder that sometimes the world surprises us in ways we never expected. So you close your eyes, letting the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You step into a private menagerie tucked behind the high walls of an aristocratic estate, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and animal fur. Lanterns flicker on iron hooks, casting soft shadows across wooden enclosures filled with creatures from every corner of the known world. Peacocks that strut like royalty, monkeys that chatter like gossiping nobles, and a pair of ostriches that seem deeply unimpressed by their surroundings. And there, in the farthest enclosure, stands something you've only ever seen in drawings, descriptions, or the stiffened forms of museum specimens. Something that should not exist, but clearly does. A live kangaroo. It pauses mid-hop, turning its head toward you with that same curious tilt it gave you back on the Australian shoreline all those years ago. Its ears twitch, its long legs shift beneath its lean frame, and then, as if deciding you're not worth the effort, it resumes its slow, deliberate grazing, tearing at the grass with quiet indifference. No one says anything at first. The gathered guests, nobles, scholars, naturalists, and the occasional bored aristocrat who's only here because they lost a bet, stand in stunned silence. Some lean forward, peering through the bars as if expecting the creature to vanish in a puff of disbelief. Others simply stare, mouths slightly open, as though witnessing a miracle unfold before them. One woman fans herself furiously. "Good heavens," she whispers. "It is real." Because yes, for centuries, people had doubted the existence of kangaroos. They had dismissed them as sailor exaggerations, questioned their anatomy, argued over their classification, and even mocked their very concept in newspapers and drawing rooms alike. But now, standing just feet away from a living, breathing specimen, doubt begins to crack. The kangaroo hops again, slowly, deliberately, as if aware of the weight of history pressing down upon it. It lands with a soft thud, tail propping it upright, eyes scanning the crowd with mild disinterest. This is not a performance. This is not a hoax. This is just life, as it has always been. Historians still argue whether this moment, the first time a live kangaroo was displayed in Europe, marked the final acceptance of the species as real, or skepticism lingered longer than records suggest. Some believe the sight of a moving, breathing kangaroo was enough to silence doubters once and for all. Others think the transition was slower, more gradual, shaped by continued study rather than a single dramatic reveal. Either way, one thing is certain. When you're staring at a hopping, pouch-bearing beast that defies every expectation you have about what an animal should be, disbelief feels like the only reasonable response. So you take a deep breath, let the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You find yourself walking through the dense Australian bush, the air thick with the scent of eucalyptus and damp earth. Around you, the land stretches endlessly, rolling hills, tangled forests, and dry plains where red dust kicks up under your boots. Somewhere nearby, a bird calls out in a voice so sharp it sounds like laughter. A lizard scuttles up a tree, vanishing into the canopy before you can get a proper look. And just beyond the next ridge, another mystery waiting to be uncovered. Because yes, kangaroos weren't the only strange creatures lurking in this land. They were just the beginning. As explorers and naturalists pushed deeper into the continent, they began cataloging everything they saw: plants that burn without flame, birds that mimic human speech, snakes that glided from tree to tree like something out of a dream. Every discovery defied expectation. Every creature challenged what they thought they knew about the natural world. And at the heart of it all was a kangaroo. The first, the most absurd, the one that had forced Europe to reconsider what was possible. But now, scientists were starting to realize there wasn't just one kind of kangaroo. There were dozens. Red kangaroos, gray kangaroos, wallabies, tree kangaroos. Each adapted to its own corner of the continent, each hopping through history like living proof that nature liked to play by its own rules. Some species lived in the highlands, their bodies built for cold temperatures and thin mountain air. Others thrived in the desert, surviving on sparse vegetation and waterless months like it was nothing. Some could run faster than a horse over short distances. Others climbed trees with ease, swinging from branch to branch as if they had never been told that kangaroos don't do that. Historians still argue whether early European scientists truly understood the diversity of Australia's wildlife, or they simply lumped everything together under the umbrella term kangaroo, because they couldn't be bothered to learn anything else. Some believe early classifications were messy, with different species mistaken for variations of the same animal well into the 19th century. Others think the sheer strangeness of the continent made logical categorization difficult. After all, how do you classify an animal that lays eggs, swims like a beaver, and has venomous spurs if you've never seen anything like it before? But oh, the platypus, that's a story for another night. Right now, you're focused on the hopping beast that started it all. Because as scientists continued studying these animals, they realized something even more astonishing. Kangaroos weren't just unique in behavior and appearance. They belonged to an entirely different group of mammals, marsupials, creatures that carry their young in pouches rather than inside their bodies like placentals back home. It was a whole new category of life, one that had evolved in isolation for millions of years, untouched by the influences that shaped the rest of the world. So you kneel beside a sleeping wallaby, watching its chest rise and fall beneath the soft fur of its belly, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. You sit beneath the stars, the night air cool and still around you like a hush that stretches across time. The kangaroo enclosure is quiet now, its inhabitant long since curled up in the soft grass, tail tucked beneath its body, pouch empty for the moment but never for long. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls out into the dark, its voice blending with the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. And as you lean back against a wooden bench, wrapped in the warmth of blankets and the weight of centuries, you realize something strange. The story of the kangaroo isn't just about an animal. It's about belief, about how we accept or reject the unfamiliar until it becomes familiar, until it becomes part of our world, whether we expected it to or not. Because yes, for centuries, people doubted the existence of kangaroos. They read reports from explorers, saw sketches brought back from faraway lands, heard stories whispered in drawing rooms and debated in scientific halls. And they laughed. They scoffed. They questioned whether such a creature could possibly exist outside of sailor exaggeration and artistic imagination. And yet, here it is, real, breathing, hopping through history like it was always meant to be there. Historians still argue whether the skepticism toward kangaroos was rooted in genuine disbelief or simply a reluctance to admit that the world contained things beyond European understanding. Some believe the early descriptions were exaggerated, shaped more by sailor superstition than scientific accuracy. Others think the sheer strangeness of the animal made it difficult to accept without seeing it firsthand. But now, no one doubts them anymore. Kangaroos are everywhere. In textbooks, on flags, in cartoons, in the wild spaces of Australia, where they bound across the land like living legends. They become symbols of a continent, of discovery, of the idea that sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real lesson here. That the world doesn't always fit neatly into what we expect. That nature likes to surprise us, to challenge our assumptions, to remind us that just because something sounds absurd doesn't mean it isn't true. So you take a deep breath, let the weight of history settle over you like a warm blanket, and remind yourself, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, even if that truth has a pouch. The wind slows. The stars stretch endlessly above you, blinking like distant campfires scattered across the sky. You feel it now not just in your bones, but in the quiet hush of the world around you. The past breathes gently beside you, not with fanfare or war drums, but with stillness, with peace. You lean back against a wooden bench, letting your breath slow, letting your thoughts drift like dust caught in a breeze. No rush, no need to chase anything. Just this, just now, just the soft hum of history settling into silence. Around you, nothing moves. Not the sleeping kangaroo behind its bars, not the tall eucalyptus trees swaying gently in the night air, not the distant hills where time has stood still for centuries. Everything waits, quietly, patiently, and so do you. Your body feels heavier now, sinking gently into the stillness, like sand settling after a long day's wind. Your mind softens, stretches, slows, like honey dripping from a spoon on a summer afternoon. No sharp edges, no sudden turns, just warmth, just ease, just the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat, slowing, softening, fading, like the hush of a world that knows how to rest, like the gentle turning of stars above a sleeping earth. And somewhere deep inside your chest, wonder sloshes gently beside you. Not forgotten, not lost, just waiting. Waiting for someone else to take a step into the unknown, to question, to discover, to march forward once more. But not tonight. Tonight is for stillness, for silence, for sleep. So let go. Let your breath slow even more. Let your body sink deeper into this ancient hush. There is no hurry, no place to be, just the quiet, steady rhythm of your heart, beating slower now, softer, quieter. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. Dream.